Back in 2015 or 16, Apple had pulled out the headphone jacks from their smartphones, and then it gave rise to $1 billion wireless earphones industry.
On today's episode, we have Varun Gupta, the man who built a 700 crore earbuds empire while being completely bootstrapped. Boult is becoming the go-to massy choice for lakhs of Indians, known for its quality and affordable earbuds and wearables. In this episode, we sit with Varun to uncover the economics of making an earbud, insights into India's audio market, and how he built a 700 crore empire without any funding. Varun, want to start off very broad, want to zoom out a lot, and want to talk to you about your childhood. So what did that look like? Where did you grow up? How was childhood, if you could tell us?
So I was born and bred in Delhi. And in my initial schooling years, I was studious, and then I went for my engineering. I got into some information retrieval research, joined Yahoo in Spain for some time. So when I got into my MBA, I wanted to build something by myself. And I was the only student in my batch to opt out of summer placements and to do a startup as my summer placement. I ran it for about a year during my MBA days. And then I was getting an opportunity to work with an international media firm. I joined that in 2014. Eventually, I went to Snapdeal as well because e-commerce was the buzz of the town back in 2014-15. While working for that company, I started my second startup. I started my third startup back in 2015 end, which was about e-commerce consulting because I'd worked for an e-commerce company. And so we went to a lot of offline heavy brands and helped them build their e-commerce business, which is where I understood the market, how e-commerce functions as a channel, how brands function. We also happen to consult many audio companies, both Indian and international, which is where we got our insight in terms of what the market is like, what are the gaps. And then around end of 2016, early 2017, I started spending a lot of time near where the products are manufactured. And at that point in time, the entire audio industry was manufactured. All the products were manufactured in China. I spent 6 months there cracking that. And finally, once I got some confidence, which is when we launched in 2017 with a platform called Myntra. While I was working with a lot of audio companies, and of course we were studying data in and out, we understood the market gap, which was about around two things fundamentally. One, that the entire space was becoming commoditized. As we saw smartphones industry, it was sort of plateauing and it was growing pre that era. And we saw that people were only talking about features and pricing, and nobody would talk about design. So we wanted to build something which was very design heavy. Second, the market gap was around the wireless industry booming, because back in 2015 or 16, Apple had pulled out the headphone jacks from their smartphones, and then it gave rise to $1 billion wireless earphones industry. And until then, all earphones used to come in this smartphone box. So people never really bought a lot of earphones. However, when we started, the wireless industry was very small, but we wanted to bet on future. We did not want to launch another set of products that everybody else was doing, which is where, using these two levers, we launched with our first collection in Myntra.
Oh, before we get into that, quickly, if you've been liking this video, you love the GrowthX newsletter. Every week, we dive into 3 recent business stories and demystify it with crisp insights delivered right to your inbox. Last week, we covered the impact of Zomato's name change on its business, Pine Labs' growth playbook, and Shein's India comeback. The GrowthX newsletter is absolutely free, and you can subscribe to it with the link in the description. Take me to this day, though. The day when the Wave earphones went live. Tell me everything that was built up to it, the moment it went live, and you seeing the numbers come up and everything that happened after. Let's, I think, double click on the day a little bit.
So while people just talk about the day when you really made it big and then things started falling in place, there was a very interesting backstory to it. So I'd spent about 6 months outside the country building the product and it was a lot of hit and trial, because when you're building something for the first time, it doesn't come easy. Secondly, there was a delay because, of course, when you're new, you don't know how shipments work, how logistics works, how certifications, packaging. There were a lot of things coming together and there was a huge delay. However, the end of season sale could not be moved. I still remember we got that shipment 48 hours before the sale was going live. And I and my family had to pack it overnight. And we delivered it by ourselves. And the shipment size was so small, I could fit that into my own car. We didn't need a truck. So I myself went to the delivery warehouse and I stood outside for 2 hours, got the goods inverted, came back, made a couple of calls to ensure that the products go live in time. And then we started taking pre-orders before the sale went live. And we were just taken aback and blown away by the amount of pre-booking orders that we had gotten on the app for the end of season sale. Also, coming back to the backstory, we did not even have capital to manufacture or source these goods or even the raw materials. So we had a purchase order from Myntra. We went to the bank for the first loan. Took us a lot of convincing to get that first 13 lakh loan. We got that loan, billed it to some of my suppliers, and then finally we could get that shipment, customs, and getting packaging, all of that certification together. And then we sold the first unit. And it was a dream come true. It wasn't about the numbers, honestly, at that point in time. It wasn't how many people bought. It was more about that feeling sinking in that, yes, I have access to my first customer, and then they believe in us.
I think coming to the market first, break down the entire market, please. I think let's stick to audio first. And what does each category look like? I'm sure it's divided into, home, and there's wearables and all of that. Can we divide the market first and then we'll see where Boult fits in?
The category that we primarily operate in is called wearables. And wearables is broadly divided into two parts. One is smartwatches and second is audio. Now, within audio, you have personal audio and then you have home audio. And then we also have ventured into new categories like dash cameras, power banks. But still, 98% of our revenue comes from wearables. Still, about 80% of our revenue comes from audio, wherein we have headphones, and then we have home audio products. Now, within personal audio, we have three broad categories. One is called TWS, True Wireless Stereo. And then we have wireless neckbands. And the third category is called over-ear headphones. Of course, they were small speakers, which also gets into personal audio. In terms of market size, audio is about $1.5 billion market, about 10-12,000 crore market in India. And smartwatches is another 5,000 crores in India. So put together, it's about $1.8 to $2 billion market, about 15 to 17,000 crores big in India. And about 70 to 75% of that trade happens on e-commerce marketplaces. And online versus offline was 70-75% versus 20-25%. Within personal audio, TWS being about 50%, neckbands being about 25%, and over-ear headphones being about 10%, per small speakers being about another 10%. For us, more than 50% revenue comes from True Wireless Stereo, which is the biggest category for us, followed by neckbands. Put together, they're about 75%, 80% of our audio revenue. Audio for us is about 75 to 80% of our business, and smartwatches is another 20-25%. And new categories right now are still about 5 to 10% put together.
Let's stick to TWS, truly wireless. Let's break this down. What does competition look like? Where do players operate?
So TWS, True Wireless Stereo, is about 4 to 5,000 crores in terms of market size, with an ASP about 14 to 1,500 rupees. Out of that, there are international players and there are Indian players. Interestingly, and proudly so, all of the Indian brands put together occupy about 75 to 80% market share in India. Now, amongst the Indian players, the largest player is Boult, and we're the second largest player in this category. They have about 30% market share, and we have about 14% market share in this category. Then we have other players like Noise. There is another player called Mivi. And then we have Chinese players like Xiaomi, Realme, Vivo. There's the OnePlus group. And then we have, of course, Apple and international players like Sennheiser, JBL, Skullcandy, and so on. All of the Indian brands, as I said, do about 75% in this category. About Chinese companies do about 15 to 20%, and the remaining 5 to 10% is taken by American and German and Korean players.
Let's talk a lot about the user? Who are these people? What do they care about? And insights that you have here.
More than 80% of our customers are men. A huge demand, about 40% of demand comes from the southern part of the country. Another 25% comes from west. Overall e-commerce and our demand, about more than 60% comes from west and southern part of the country. And lastly, the age group was between 15 to 35. So this age group contributes to more than 75% of our revenue. And we split that into 15 to 25, which is about 40%, and 25 to 35, which is about another 28-30%. And keeping in mind their behaviors, we understood that they commute a lot. They are connected to their smartphones and thus spend a lot of time on entertainment.
Coming to unit economics, can you break it down? For example, I think just let's talk about TWS and what does unit economics look like for, like, say, one TWS earphone for Boult? That'll be great.
So firstly, for you to be able to crack a market, your product cost in the D2C industry has to be less than 60%. An ideal scenario, it has to be under 50%. Now, here is the breakdown. Because if you're selling a product for, let's say, 2,000 rupees, your manufacturing cost has to be under 1,000 rupees. Because about 25 to 30% of this cost goes into distribution. Now, there are two kinds of channels. One is online and second is offline. If you venture into offline as a channel, you have 2 to 4 layers of partners who are selling your products. They could be a super stockist or a distributor. They could be a micro distributor. They'd be a retailer, or maybe a wholesaler in between. So there are 2 to 4 partners in between before the product reaches to your consumer. And on average, every partner would make anywhere between 5 to 10%. So when you compound that, your distribution margin goes to anywhere between 25 to 35%. Now, if you come and talk about online, so in our category, the standard margin is between 15 to 20%. Over and above, there are logistics cost. Which has two parts primarily. One is storage and warehousing cost. There is fulfillment cost. And thirdly, the highest factor is the logistics, the shipment cost, which is between 50 to 70 rupees. And as a product, the percentage of the product cost, it goes between 5 to 7% if I consider the ASP to be between 1 to 2,000 rupees. Now, what we miss out on is the real marketing cost. Put in two buckets. One is brand budget and second is performance marketing. Now, brand and performance marketing put together takes about at least 10 to 15%. And now it comes to the third part, which is managing returns. Because returns, especially in e-commerce, and serviceability. The cost of managing returns and service would be another 5%. Now, next cost is the cost of capital, which is between 1 to 2%. Because if you're working both with distributors, you need to give a credit, which is between 30 to 90 days. And broadly, you can take 1% as cost of capital for a month. So which takes us to a 1 to 3% cost of capital for offline. And again, if you're working with e-commerce marketplaces, so there is again a 45-day, 60-day payment cycle, which is about a 1.5 to 2% cost of capital just after you've sold the product from your warehouse. But there is a lot of cost of holding inventory in your warehouse. So the cost of capital on average goes to about 2.5 to 3% minimum for any company. And lastly, you get overheads of running the entire company. So there could be an office that you're renting. There could be salaries that you pay to yourself as a founder or an entrepreneur. Your overheads would be at least a 5%. All of that comes to about 45 to 50%. So I repeat, so the breakdown would be distribution cost would be about 25 to 30%. The marketing cost would be about 15 to 20%. Then the cost of capital would be about 2.5-3%. So all of that swells up to about 45-50%, and more often than not goes beyond 50%. Now, if your product cost is under 50%, then you can afford a certain margin for yourself as an entrepreneur.
I think final question. We asked this because not for once we want people to think that, hey, building a startup is interesting, fancy. And because we end up having conversations with founders who've built large companies, that most people can do it. As a matter of fact, most people will fail in the journey. So want you to reflect, want you to think back about days that maybe things didn't work out, near death moments or something like that, where things weren't working out like the way you wanted them to, and share stories of failures, honestly, that people can learn from. And yeah, how do you reflect?
We had a lot of failures. So the first lesson was that you need not get bogged down by failures. Secondly, it's important to understand when to press the no button or when to call it off. Sometimes we as founders and entrepreneurs are too attached to our businesses. And possibly when I look back, I was really emotionally attached to my businesses, and it took me a lot of time, convincing, and failure to move out of my previous startups. But today, in hindsight, possibly whenever I did move out, it was for good. I learned a lot, and I gathered the courage, time, and momentum to be able to build something else. Thirdly, we need to understand that not everybody is meant to be an entrepreneur. It is a very lonely journey, because if you're working for somebody or if you're working in a company, if you're studying in a college, you're always surrounded by like-minded people. But when you start your shop, you're sitting alone in a room, maybe with a couple of folks, and you do not have a lot of people or even time to go out and talk to a lot of people. It was a very lonely journey for the first 5 years for me. But once we started scaling up, we could build teams. That's when we could build or have like minded people around ourselves. So that was more inspiring and gave us a lot of confidence.